September the 1st, 1666. London's most famous baker went to bed and forgot to put out his oven. By morning, the greatest city in England was on fire. This is the story of the Great Fire of London. To understand why London burned so completely, you need to understand what London was in the year 1666. It was one of the largest cities in Europe, home to roughly 350,000 people, crowded into a space that had barely changed since the Middle Ages. The streets were narrow, winding, and dark. The buildings were packed together so tightly that the upper floors of houses on opposite sides of the street nearly touched each other overhead. Most of those buildings were made almost entirely of wood, their roofs covered in thatch, their walls sealed with pitch, a black, tar-like substance that kept out the rain but burned with extraordinary ferocity. Inside those homes, people cooked on open fires, lit their rooms with candles, and heated their water over wood-burning stoves. In the workshops and warehouses along the riverfront, merchants stored barrels of oil, tallow for candles, rope soaked in tar, coal, spirits, and gunpowder. The entire city was, in the words of one historian, a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And the summer of 1666 had been the driest anyone could remember. After months without significant rain, the timber frames of the city's buildings had dried out completely. The thatched roofs were brittle. The dust on the narrow cobblestone streets was fine and light. The wooden docks and wharves along the Thames were bone dry. The city had experienced smaller fires before. London had burned, partially, as recently as 1633. But nothing in living memory had prepared anyone for what was about to happen. There were no fire brigades in 1666, no professional firefighters, no organized emergency response of any kind. If a fire broke out, it was up to neighbors with leather buckets and hand-operated water pumps to fight it, and even those resources were limited. The water pump nearest to the area where the fire would start was, on that particular night, out of order. It began just after midnight in the early hours of Sunday, September the 2nd, 1666. Thomas Fariner was the king's baker, the man responsible for supplying bread to the royal household of King Charles II. His bakery stood on Pudding Lane, a narrow street in the heart of the city, not far from London Bridge and the River Thames. On the evening of September the 1st, Fariner went through his usual closing routine, checking that the fires in his ovens had been properly extinguished before going to bed. He either made a mistake or he missed something. Because sometime around 1 in the morning, a spark from the still smoldering embers of the oven caught a pile of dry firewood stacked nearby. Within minutes, the bakery was on fire. Fariner himself woke to the smell of smoke. He managed to escape with his family, climbing out of an upstairs window and scrambling across the rooftops of neighboring buildings. His household assistant, a young woman whose name history has not preserved, was too frightened to follow. She remained inside. She became the first recorded victim of the Great Fire of London. The neighbors were alerted almost immediately. A parish constable arrived within the hour and assessed the situation. The adjoining houses, he concluded, would need to be demolished to stop the fire spreading. In the firefighting logic of the 17th century, the best way to stop fire was to create gaps, empty spaces that the flames had nowhere to cross. But demolishing houses required the permission of the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, who was summoned from his bed in the middle of the night. Bloodworth arrived, looked at the fire, and made a decision that history has not forgiven him for. He refused to give permission to demolish the buildings. The houses were rented, he said, and he could not locate the owners to authorize the demolition. According to one contemporary account, he looked at the fire, said, "A woman could piss it out," and went back to bed. By the time he was summoned again, hours later, half the street was burning. What transformed a bakery fire into an unstoppable catastrophe was the wind. A strong, dry east wind had been blowing steadily for days. On the night of the fire, it picked up the flames from Pudding Lane and carried them westward through the city, jumping from building to building. leaping across the narrow streets, catching on the dried thatch and pitch-coated timber of the medieval structures with terrifying ease. By Monday morning, September the 3rd, the fire had reached the riverfront warehouses along Thames Street. This was the moment everything changed. Those warehouses were packed with some of the most flammable substances in the city: barrels of lamp oil and tallow for candles, bales of hemp and rope, stores of coal, casks of brandy and spirits. When the fire reached them, they did not simply burn, they exploded. Great fireballs of orange and black rolled up into the sky over the Thames. The heat became so intense that people standing on the opposite bank of the river, across the water, had to shield their faces. Samuel Pepys, a senior official in the Royal Navy and one of the most diligent diarists in English history, watched from a boat on the river. He recorded what he saw in the kind of precise, almost stunned detail that makes his account one of the most extraordinary eyewitness documents of any disaster in history. He watched a city of 350,000 people preparing to flee. Families loading their belongings onto carts, onto boats, onto their own backs. People throwing furniture from upper windows into the street below, then watching it burn before they could retrieve it. The pigeons, he noted, were so reluctant to leave their roosting places on the eaves of the houses that they hovered around the burning buildings until their wings caught fire. And they fell. Pepys traveled to Whitehall Palace to report directly to King Charles II. The king, to his credit, took the situation seriously. He authorized the demolition of buildings in the fire's path. He ordered the Duke of York, his brother, the future King James II, to take command of the response. He reportedly rode out into the city himself, handing coins to exhausted firefighters and ordering them to continue. But by Monday evening, it was already too late for much of the city. The fire had consumed Cheapside, the great commercial heart of London. It had reached the edge of the old Roman city walls. St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the grandest buildings in England, was directly in its path. By Tuesday, September the 4th, the fire had been burning for 2 days with almost no sign of slowing. St. Paul's Cathedral caught fire. The lead on its enormous roof melted and poured down the streets like a river of liquid metal. The stones of the ancient structure cracked and exploded from the heat. Eyewitnesses described the sound as like sustained cannon fire, echoing across the city for hours. Books from the cathedral's library and nearby booksellers had been stored in St. Faith's Church in the crypt below. In the belief that the stone vaults would protect them, they burned anyway, the fire finding its way through every crack and gap, consuming tens of thousands of irreplaceable manuscripts and printed volumes in a single night. Fighting the Great Fire of London was a problem unlike anything the city had ever faced. There was no organized system, no chain of command, no reliable supply of water, and no equipment capable of matching the scale of the blaze. The primary method of firefighting was the firebreak, demolishing buildings ahead of the fire to create open gaps that the flames could not cross. But in the early days of the fire, the Lord Mayor's refusal to authorize demolitions had cost the city critical hours. By the time the order finally came, the fire was moving faster than demolition crews could work. People fought with whatever they had. Leather fire buckets passed hand to hand along human chains from the river, water squirts, hand pump devices that could spray a small jet of water, useful for dampening individual beams, but completely outmatched by a fire of this scale. Metal hooks mounted on long poles, used to pull down burning thatch and timber before the flames could jump to neighboring buildings. On Tuesday night, with the fire showing no signs of stopping, the Duke of York ordered a more drastic approach. Soldiers from the Tower of London were authorized to use gunpowder to blow up entire rows of buildings, creating fire breaks wide enough that even the strong east wind could not carry the flames across. The explosions that rolled across London through the night were heard as far away as Oxford, 60 miles to the west. It was a brutal, destructive solution, but it worked. Combined with a fortunate change in the wind, which began to drop and shift direction on Wednesday, September the 5th. The gunpowder fire breaks finally began to contain the blaze. By the early hours of Thursday, September the 6th, the Great Fire of London had burned itself out. 4 days and 4 nights, from a bakery on Pudding Lane across the medieval heart of one of the greatest cities in the world, all the way to the western edge of the old city at Temple Church. When the smoke finally cleared, the scale of the destruction was almost incomprehensible. Roughly 80% of the old city of London had been destroyed. 13,200 houses gone. 87 churches, including the great medieval St. Paul's Cathedral, reduced to rubble and ash. 44 livery company halls, the centers of London's trade guilds, the Royal Exchange, the Custom House, 3 of the 4 city gates, 436 acres of the city burned to nothing. Approximately 100,000 people had been made homeless overnight. They flooded out of the city in their thousands, setting up makeshift camps in the open fields of Moorfields, Islington, and Highgate to the north. King Charles II ordered food supplies to be brought to the displaced and set up a relief fund. But for many, the situation was desperate. They had lost everything: their homes, their businesses, their livelihoods, their possessions, their savings. Remarkably, the official death toll was recorded as just 6 people. 6 for a disaster that destroyed 4/5 of a major European capital. Historians have long debated this figure. Some accept it broadly, arguing that the fire moved slowly enough in many areas that most people had time to escape. Others believe the true death toll was much higher, that the deaths of the poor, the homeless, and the most vulnerable were simply never recorded, their bodies never identified in the ruins, their absence never formally noted. The truth, as with so much of history, is that we will never know with certainty. What we do know is what came next. Almost immediately after the fire, the search for someone to blame began. Rumors spread that the fire had been deliberately set by Catholics, by the French, by Dutch agents, by foreign saboteurs of some kind. England was at war with both France and the Dutch Republic at the time, and fear and grief had no trouble finding targets. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert stepped forward and confessed to starting the fire, claiming he had done so as part of a foreign conspiracy. He was tried, convicted, and hanged at Tyburn in October of 1666. Only after his death did evidence emerge that he had not even been in London when the fire started. He had still been at sea, on a ship in the North Sea, on the night of September the 1st. He had almost certainly been mentally unstable, possibly coerced, and almost certainly innocent. It was a miscarriage of justice that history has noted, but could not undo. An official parliamentary inquiry later concluded that the fire had been caused by the hand of God, a great wind, and a very dry season. In other words, an accident, a terrible, catastrophic, world-altering accident. The rebuilding of London began almost before the ashes had cooled. King Charles II understood that a ruined capital was a political and economic emergency. Within days of the fire ending, he had commissioned plans for a new city. Several architects put forward ambitious proposals, including the scientist and polymath Christopher Wren, who envisioned a grand, rational city of wide boulevards and sweeping open plazas, inspired by the new cities being built on the continent. The plans were never fully realized. Landowners, merchants, and citizens were desperate to rebuild as quickly as possible on their existing plots, and the complexity of negotiating new street plans proved overwhelming. But what did emerge in the years following the fire was something genuinely transformative. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 changed everything about how London was constructed. New buildings were required by law to be made of brick or stone. No more timber frames, no more thatch. Streets were made wider to allow light, air, and, crucially, easier escape in case of future fires. Building heights were regulated. The river frontage was cleared and improved. A new, rational system of property surveying was established. Christopher Wren did not get his grand boulevard plan. But he did get something arguably more lasting. He was appointed to oversee the rebuilding of the city's churches, and over the following decades, he designed 51 new parish churches for London. His greatest achievement was the new St. Paul's Cathedral, begun in 1675 and completed in 1710. It still stands today, at the heart of the city, a direct legacy of the Great Fire. A monument was erected near the spot where the fire had started on Pudding Lane. Designed by Wren and his colleague Robert Hooke, it stands exactly 202 feet tall and is positioned exactly 202 feet from the bakery where the fire began. It is the tallest isolated stone column in the world. It still stands, and it still draws visitors today. Over 3.5 centuries later, the Great Fire of London feels on the surface like a uniquely 17th century disaster. Wooden buildings, open fires, no emergency services. A world almost unimaginably different from our own. But look a little closer, and the connections to the world we live in today are remarkably direct. The fire insurance industry was born directly from the ashes of 1666. Before the Great Fire, there was no such thing as fire insurance in England. After it, London merchants and property owners scrambled to find ways to protect themselves from catastrophic loss. The first fire insurance companies were established in London within years of the fire. They created their own private fire brigades, sending teams of men with equipment to fight fires at the insured properties they had a financial interest in protecting. Those private brigades eventually evolved, over a century and a half, into the professional, publicly funded fire services that protect every major city in the world today. Building codes and planning regulations, the rules that govern how cities are built, how close buildings can be to each other, what materials can be used, how wide streets must be. These also trace their modern origins in large part to the Great Fire of London and the Rebuilding Act that followed it. The next time you see a fire exit sign in a building, or notice that a city street is wide enough for an emergency vehicle to pass through, you are seeing, in some small way, the legacy of a bakery fire on Pudding Lane in September of 1666. And then there is the human element. The element that, no matter how many centuries pass, never really changes. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the search for scapegoats. The desperate need to assign blame to an outsider, a foreigner, an enemy, the innocent man who confessed to a crime he did not commit and was executed before the truth could save him. The official inquiry that pointed to weather and accident, while the public preferred a more satisfying narrative of conspiracy and deliberate destruction. These are not medieval responses. They are human responses. We have seen them in our own time, in our own cities, after our own disasters, with uncomfortable regularity. The Great Fire of London destroyed a city in 4 days, but it also, in its terrible way, gave birth to a safer, better planned, more resilient version of that city. London rose from its own ashes into something that could not have existed without the catastrophe that preceded it. It is one of history's most enduring lessons. That destruction, however complete, is rarely the end of the story. In 4 days, the Great Fire of London destroyed everything that had been built over centuries. But from those ashes came a new city and a new way of thinking about how we protect the places we call home. Subscribe to Edge of History for a new story every week. See you in the next one.